My name is Ravi Bahadur Singh. I am the Deputy Chairman of STEP, and we thank you for attending this forum today, which has been organized by STEP. STEP is a society of trust and estate practitioners, and part of its function is to educate the service providers in Anguilla and all persons interested in financial services on both local and international initiatives which affect the financial services. Firstly, let me offer my apologies for Mr. Carlisle Rogers, who is actually the chairman of STEP, who is unfortunately sequestered in Trinidad right now and could not be here today. It is a great pleasure that I introduce our featured speaker today, Dr. Daniel J. Mitchell, who will be speaking to us about the global financial crisis and the current initiatives by the OECD against IFCs. IFCs, of course, are international financial centers, of which Anguilla is one. Dr. Mitchell is a top expert on tax reform and supply-side tax policy. He's a strong advocate of the flat tax and international tax competition. And he has been involved in the fight to defend IFC's role in the global economy for many years. Before joining the Cato Institute, of which he's now a senior fellow, Dr. Mitchell was a senior fellow of the Heritage Foundation and an economist for Senator Bob Packwood and the Senate Finance Committee. He also served on the 1988 Bush-Quayle transition team and was director of tax and budget policy for Citizens for a Sound Economy. His articles can be found in such publications as the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Investor Business Daily, and Washington Times. He is the author of The Flat Tax, Freedom, Fairness, Jobs, and Growth, which was published in 1996. And he's also the co-author of Global Tax Revolution, The Rise of Tax Competition and the Battle to Defend It, which was published in 2008. He's a frequent guest on radio and television and a popular speaker on the lecture circuit. Dr. Mitchell holds both bachelor's and master's degrees in economics from the University of Georgia and a Ph.D. in economics from George Mason University. He's a frequent commentator on television and has appeared on all the major networks, including CBS, NBC, ABC, CNBC, and C-SPAN. He currently makes a weekly appearance on Street Signs, which is on CNBC on Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Dr. Mitchell has served as a staffer on the Miller Commission, which examined the finances of the Cayman Islands in 2009. And he is certainly no stranger to Anguilla, having been here, I believe, 4 times before. So without any further hesitation, Dr. Mitchell.
Well, thank you very much. Although I should correct one thing about the my bio there. I'm not actually an advocate of a flat tax. I'm an advocate of a flat tax compared to what the U.S. has right now. Ideally, we would have no income tax at all. So I view the flat tax as a stepping stone. Of course, I'm pretty depressed about even getting to that stepping stone. We tend to have things get worse, not better, in the U.S., which sort of actually leads right into my presentation, because I want to start by talking about the global fiscal crisis. And we've all seen what's been happening in Cyprus right now. While in some sense, what's happening in Cyprus isn't that different than what's already been happening in Greece, what's already been happening in Italy and Spain and in Portugal, and barring some sort of dramatic changes, what will happen in France, in Belgium, in the United Kingdom, and the United States. In other words, just about every OECD country, every developed country, industrialized country, however you want to describe it, is facing the same basic pressures. They made spending promises that are enormous heading into the future, and their ability to finance those spending promises is not, let's just say, it's not very robust. And because they've made these commitments to spend money, commitments to powerful interest groups and voting blocs, one of the implications of that is that they are desperately seeking additional sources of tax revenue. And this is where it rebounds, unfortunately, against IFCs. Politicians tend to think that there's a giant pot of gold sitting at the end of the rainbow. And that pot of gold is somewhere here on Anguilla and other offshore jurisdictions. And so whether you're talking to Senator Levin from Michigan in the U.S., or whether you're talking to bureaucrats at the OECD or the European Commission, they somehow think that if they just impose enough requirements, enough rules, enough regulations, enough reporting, that somehow that pot of gold will be found and can be magically transported back to their countries to deal with this financial crisis and fiscal crisis that they're having. And what you see in Cyprus right now is I think, really making them sober up, although they're not really sure how to define it, because Cyprus, of course, in and of itself is an IFC. So it's an IFC, but it's part of the European Union, which, of course, is hand in glove working with the OECD to try to squash tax competition. So with Cyprus, the bureaucrats at the OECD and the people in the Treasury departments and the finance ministries around the world, they're not sure exactly how to respond. In part, they want to say, aha, look at this. Cyprus is a tax haven. Tax havens are automatically bad for some reason. And so therefore, the fact that Cyprus is going through all this economic turmoil, it must be an argument against tax havens. Now, on the other hand, you have tax havens around the world that are among the most fiscally strong and prosperous and stable countries in the world, like Switzerland. When every other country has descended into bankruptcy and the Dark Ages has returned to the world, and there are roving bands of marauders going across countries, Switzerland will still be a stable, prosperous country. So obviously, there's nothing about being a, quote, tax haven, unquote, per se, that causes a nation to be fiscally unstable. But of course, Cyprus did manage to get into that situation. How did Cyprus get into that situation? Well, very simple. They have a big banking system. 25% of their deposits come from Russia. Some of it might be dodgy, but a lot of it is just business owners and entrepreneurs who don't trust the Russian banking system, don't trust Putin, don't want to have their money arbitrarily confiscated. So they have their money offshore for very sensible reasons. But when you have the two big banks in Cyprus taking in all these deposits and then turning around and, for the most part, buying Greek government debt, and then when the Greek government, of course, winds up not being able to pay its bills and winds up arbitrarily giving haircuts to Greek government bonds, well, guess what? If you're a big holder of Greek government bonds, bingo, your assets are knocked down in value, and so all of a sudden you have all these deposits, but they've been used to buy Greek government bonds that aren't worth nearly as much as they used to be. And then when you have a government, and this is the case in Cyprus, that over the last 15 years has increased government spending so much, it means that the Cyprus government is in no position to borrow money to recapitalize the banks. In other words, Cyprus got in trouble, or the Cyprus banks, to be more technical, got in trouble for the same reason, not the same reason, but in the same way that U.S. financial institutions got in trouble with bad housing assets. You know, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, mortgage-backed securities, all those things. U.S. banks thought they had assets worth this much. All of a sudden, those assets were worth this much, and some of them became insolvent. The U.S. government came in, unfortunately, and recapitalized them instead of shutting them down. The same thing sort of has been happening in Cyprus. They thought they had this many assets. They really have this many assets, but the Cyprus government can't borrow the money to recapitalize them because nobody trusts the Cyprus government any more than they trust the Cyprus banks. So it's not an issue of being a tax haven, quote unquote. It's an issue of having banks that made very poor decisions, but it is in a really significant way that I don't think any of us quite appreciate like we should. It's really brought back to life this notion that the Western world is in fiscal crisis. Because everyone sort of in Europe was hoping, oh, we sort of got past the rough patch. We sort of did these bailouts of Spain and Italy and Greece and Portugal and Ireland. We sort of dealt with all that, and now things were stabilizing. And everyone was beginning to hope that somehow they had light at the end of the tunnel and they had overcome the problem. And what's happened in crisis in Cyprus has been a big slap across the face for the Europeans, because now, guess what? If you do a haircut to depositors, and we don't even know what Cyprus is going to do yet, because they're desperately looking around. Will the Russians give them money? Will the IMF? Will the European Central Bank? They're hoping somebody's going to do something dramatic to somehow save them. Because right now, there's a big hole in their banking system, and they have a government that can't fill it. Who's going to fill it? Well, if they can't fill it, then by definition, they have to give the depositors haircut. So in the same way that the Greek government gave the Cyprus banks a haircut, the Cyprus banks may have to turn around and give depositors haircuts. And once that happens, it sends